This program is about the most complicated machines on Earth. Living creatures. And it's about a new kind of science, asking engineering questions of animals and plants. How do they work? What are they made from? How do they move? What's being discovered is often surprising and bizarre. So how is the study of natural engineering different from what engineers do? Marine biologist Professor Steve Wainwright.
Human engineer is given a particular problem, say to design a boat. The boat must have a certain strength. If it's a certain kind of boat, it must be able to break through ice. It must be able to stand waves and wind. And the materials that the engineer has to work with, steel and other metals, things like that, are very well known. The mechanical properties are very well known, and in a sense, all the engineer has to do is create the design to put these things together to make the boat to do its job. Now, natural engineers, in looking at a plant or an animal, they don't really know what problems have been solved over the course of evolution. All we can sort of assume is that the design is a good one, that it's good because it has survived, because the bad designs have been literally eaten up by the good designs.
What makes a good design in nature? Animals and plants consist of dozens of different parts, so the answer is complicated. But one approach is to select the basic elements and look at each one in turn. John Curry is a professor at York University. On the northeast coast of England, he has found a neat example of natural design and the way it varies in meeting different needs. The animals that interest him are barnacles.
Barnacles are very characteristic animals of the intertidal region here, and we can see them over many of these rocks. Once they're settled on a bare rock like this, they're fixed there for life and they can't move. They earn their living by filtering out plankton and other things from the seawater, essentially with their legs, which they push out in a great big fan and kick the food into their mouths.
This is a tale of not one, but two barnacles. A second species lives further out to sea. Although they are permanently underwater, these barnacles look quite similar. But Curry suspected that the different places in which they lived would affect the way they were built. He wanted to know how strong the barnacle shells were. That meant subjecting them to a little high technology. First, the exposed intertidal barnacle was tested. Curry thought it would be stronger to stand up to buffeting from the tides. It took 20 pounds to crush it. Next, a subtidal barnacle of the same size. To Curry's surprise, it was 4 times as strong. Why was there such a difference? At first, Curry thought they might be made from different materials, but the shells turned out to be remarkably similar. So then he looked more closely at the individual plates.
we had a look at the engineering, the workmanship, the way the plates of the barnacle were put together. And what we have here is one of the plates of the strong one, the subtidal form, and we can see that there is a groove which fits it into the next plate. And as we increase the magnification, we can see that this groove has got very neat and regular further grooves on it. On those grooves, there are still further grooves, so that when it fits in with the thing that will fit into there, there is a very tight and neat fit.
When the weaker barnacle was examined, a difference was immediately apparent. The joint was much less elaborate.
And we see that there are none of these teeth, that the plate just stops. And in fact, it butts against something which just stops on the other side, and it's not at all a good joint. And in fact, we find whatever we look at in this barnacle, it is not engineered very well, the way it sticks to the shell. Any comparison is quite different. Any comparison we might like to make shows that this is really rather shoddily built, jerry-built, thrown up in a hurry.
These barnacles are shoddily built because they don't expect to live very long. They are eaten by whelks, which climb on top of them and force open their valves. A strong shell is no help. The barnacle tries instead to reproduce quickly before its whelp comes along. The strong barnacles live much longer. To survive, good shells are vital. They have some terrifying foes. It's the end for this barnacle, but with its strong shell, it may have survived enough attacks to have reproduced too. Nature also helps animals survive by designing them special materials. And what nature is particularly good at is making substances which bend and stretch. These are locusts. In their millions, they've plagued men since ancient times. One reason for their success is that they have one of the stretchiest materials yet found. It's in the abdomen of the female, and it comes into play when she digs a hole to lay her eggs. The eggs are laid well below the surface. As the digging progresses, the abdomen extends further and further until it's 4 times its normal length. The abdomen has rigid sections joined by thin membranes. The membranes can stretch by nearly 15 times. How this material works has been unraveled at Reading University in England by Dr. Julian Vincent. To understand how many materials work, a simple stress-strain test is usually sufficient. But with a biological material, the testing has to exactly copy the way the animal would use it.
When the locust is digging its hole, it seems to be that the most important thing is that the length of the membrane is changing in this sort of fashion, so that you haven't got a complete extension, you've got an extension in phases with periods of retraction in between. Each time the membrane retracts slightly, the force required to hold it extended drops off by quite a remarkable amount, anything up to 10 times the original force which was required to hold it out at that extension in the first place. This is a phenomenon called stress softening, and it's a phenomenon which has been found by people looking at the mechanics of rubbers, but had not previously been found in any biological materials at all.
Having this material helps locusts solve a major problem. They live in deserts where water is scarce. The eggs they lay are partially dehydrated. If the eggs are to mature, they must be laid where they can absorb water, which is why an extensible abdomen is so useful.
The best place to find a supply of water is about 8 or 9 centimeters down in the sand, in the lee of a rock or something like that. So she's got to lay her eggs at a fair depth, in the right sort of place, and then they can be assured of their water supply and develop and become the next generation of locusts.
Often, materials have to perform more than one function, so they have to be capable of behaving in different ways. One elegant example has been discovered in these giant green slugs from Vancouver. The slugs feed on vegetation and spend their lives silently gliding over the dead wood and rotting leaves, which litter the forest floor. What is so remarkable is not the slugs themselves, but the mucus they produce, the gooey slime trails they leave behind them as they move. At the University of British Columbia, Mark Denny.
When most people first look at slime, they think it's the most repulsive stuff they've ever seen. They wouldn't be caught dead working on it. However, if you can get past that initial impression and start looking at it, it turns out to be really nifty stuff.
Mucus sticks slugs to the surface on which they're sitting. What puzzled Mark Denny was how they could walk on a substance that was essentially glue. He decided to look at its mechanical properties. That meant first persuading a slug to let him have some experimental material. The mucus is placed in a test rig. Here it is possible to measure the force needed to shear it, make the molecules inside it slide past one another. The drum is lowered to gently squeeze the mucus, and the machinery is turned on. The results were intriguing. The mucus, it appeared, could switch back and forth between two quite different forms of behavior.
The first thing these experiments show is that when you start to pull on the material, that it acts like a solid. It pushes back at you pretty hard. It takes a lot of force to deform the material. However, once you've deformed it a certain extent, the material abruptly gives way. It yields into a viscous liquid. The important thing about that is that a viscous liquid is easier to move over than a solid would be. The second important thing about these experiments is that once you stop pulling on the viscous liquid, that within a very short period of time, the material can set back up into being a solid. So it's a reversible sort of thing.
Slugs are pushed along by these muscular waves. Mucus beneath each wave is liquid, and so lubricates the path. It becomes solid and sticky again once the wave passes by. This happens because networks of molecules inside the mucus are pulled apart and then spring together again.
To me, the primary niftiness is that you take something that's 98% water, it's almost totally water, throw in a little bit of this very special sort of molecule, and you end up with a material that has these really special properties, the physical properties that suit it to its function in the slug.
Animals also need strong materials to build bones and teeth. The problem is nature can't use metals. It has to make do with chalk, which is very brittle. In composites like fiberglass, we have recently found how to make brittle materials strong. The glass is packed together in millions of tiny fibers. A crack spreading through them has to break each one in turn. But it's an idea nature has used for millions of years. These fibers are made from chalk. They are found in the tooth of a sea urchin. There is a crystalline form of chalk which makes up the fibers, and an amorphous form in the matrix between. Built this way, the teeth are hard and resist abrasion. The sea urchin's virtuosity doesn't end here. It has a skeleton underneath its spines, and again, it's made from chalk. This time, it's given strength by a delicate honeycomb of interconnecting holes. And this is mother of pearl, chalk once more. But this time put together in millions of tiny scales, like an impenetrable brick wall. John Curry.
We have these hard, brittle materials, which, if they were just a single block, would crack very easily. And what natural selection has done, in various ways, in the different types, is to divide up the brittle material into a series of separate blocks so that cracks can't get very far, that a lot of work has to be put into the material to break it in two.
The patterns in nature are not produced at random. Every shape is a reply to some force from outside. Soap bubbles are shaped by surface tension. So are these creatures. They are radiolaria, microscopic animals from under the sea. Bubble shapes are imitated exactly by their delicate skeletons. These similarities were first noticed 100 years ago. And studying shapes is still a way of revealing natural designs today. Duke University in North Carolina, Steve Vogel is interested in the shapes of leaves and the forces which mold them. Collecting some of the samples is easy, but the rest call for a little more ingenuity. The tree being studied today is a white oak. What's interesting about its leaves?
For this particular tree, you notice we clipped some leaves from the bottom of the tree, and this is what we got. Rather broad leaves, not very deeply indented. On the other hand, when we went to the top of the tree, we got these very deeply indented leaves, hardly any broad expanse of blade. Quite a different thing. Looks as if it might come from, quite a different tree, in fact, although it didn't. And the question I got interested in was, why, in fact, does the oak tree go to the trouble of making leaves of such different shapes?
Vogel suspected the answer involved both the sun and the wind, so he built a very special machine.
Well, this crude-looking contraption is a very low-speed wind tunnel, so low that the top speed of the wind tunnel produces a wind which you could barely feel. I can give you some idea of what a wind tunnel like this can do by flying a maple seed in it. In fact, it produces very much the sort of wind that a leaf would experience in what we would call still air. And the wind it produces comes up from below. It comes up as if it is the breeze caused by the heating and the convective cooling of all of the other leaves on the tree.
Vogel could imitate the wind. Now he had to measure temperature. He used heat-sensitive paper. Black is cold, red-brown warm, green hot, and deep blue at the fingertips very hot. He cut leaf shapes from the paper. The leaves were heated to deep blue, and a gentle breeze was switched on. Quite quickly, the color showed the leaf on the right was cooling down. The shade leaf didn't need to be designed for losing heat, but the sun leaf was kept cool by its deep indentations, even on the calmest of days. The wind also played a part in a second, quite different kind of design Vogel found. These are the plains of the Midwest. And these are prairie dogs, which are found here in their thousands. They live in burrows, one family in each. In fact, it was the burrows rather than the animals themselves which caught Vogel's attention. The burrows stretch for 50 feet or more. In fact, they are so long, Vogel calculated, an animal inside might well run out of oxygen. They needed to be ventilated. Vogel noticed that the two entrance mounds to the burrows were always of different shapes, and that gave him the clue. He built a model burrow to test. Like the real burrow, one end sticks up further than the other. Dye is injected into the tube so that any movement will show up, and the flow tank is turned on. Almost at once, water starts to circulate through the burrow, down through the flattened end and out through the higher mound. Why does this happen?
When fluid flows across a solid surface, at the actual surface, the speed of the fluid is in fact zero compared to the more rapid movement out away from the surface. And that's the prairie dog's trick. On one end of its burrow, it puts a high mound, a crater, which sticks up into rapidly moving fluid, and on the other end, it puts, if anything, a very, very low mound. And so the two ends of the burrow are exposed to different wind speeds. And this difference in velocity is a source of energy which can be invested in ventilating the burrow.
Vogel went back to the prairies to see if it really worked there. Choosing an empty burrow, he dropped a smoke bomb down. The wind sucked out the smoke in exactly the same way, changing the air about every 10 minutes. Vogel was delighted. The prairie dog seemed unimpressed. Then Vogel found some other creatures that looked suspiciously like a prairie dog mound. These speeded-up limpets are filter feeders. They suck in water at the bottom and push it out at the top. So into Vogel's tank they went. This is an empty shell, a late limpet. But being this shape saves the living creatures energy as they siphon through their food. The reason for an animal's shape is not always obvious, and it may take careful experiments to work it out. Here on the coast of the Pacific Northwest, the very different appearances of two related creatures has been studied by Dr. Mimi Cole.
I've been interested in two species of sea anemones, one of which is a very tall, elegant, delicate-looking creature, and it lives in calm areas like this at depths of 40 feet or more. The other species of anemone that I've been interested in lives on the exposed rocky coast here in wave-swept surge channels, beat on by waves all day, and these are tough little rigid-looking creatures. The basic question I've been interested in is how do you build a sea anemone to take wave action and build another sea anemone to live in a calm, protected place like this?
These are the calm water anemones. It's easy to believe their graceful shapes reflect their peaceful surroundings. And these are the rough water variety. Their sturdy appearance looks well suited for coping with waves. To investigate how tough the anemones actually are, the forces they each encounter in their different habitats had to be measured. In the icy waters of Puget Sound, that called for a certain amount of toughness from the investigator, too. This experiment, 40 feet below the surface, measured the flow of water in the region where the delicate anemones live. The flow probe is left in position and sends out information about the currents, which is monitored from the comfort of the shore.
I record my flow data on magnetic tape, so you can actually hear how fast the current is moving over the anemones. The higher the pitch, the faster the current. This is what the current sounds like over the tall, elegant anemones that live in these calm areas like this. As you can hear, the pitch is fairly low, the flow is very steady and slow over these anemones. When I recorded current velocities at the exposed outer coast, I got something very different. As you'll hear, the pitch is higher, which means the flow is faster, and it varies a lot. What you're hearing is actually waves crashing into surge channels. The surprise, though, was when I actually recorded current velocities flowing right over the sea anemones, they were very low. The anemones essentially are hunkering down into microhabitats where the flow is as calm as it is here.
So these creatures are not as tough as they seem. How the anemones were affected by the currents was analyzed next, using beam theory. One way a beam can deform when a force is applied to it is to shear. This sideways shifting is exactly the way the rough water anemone behaves. Its short, wide shape means that when the waves push it from side to side, it only wobbles a little, like jello. A second way a beam can deform is to bend. And that, appropriately, is what the second anemone does. This anemone's tall, thin body tapers towards the top. The narrow region there behaves as a primitive joint, allowing the head to bow over as the water flows by. The drag forces experienced by the anemones was also measured. And with the help of some neatly carpeted models, how the different parts of the anemones affected the drag could be worked out. The results of these experiments produced some more surprises.
When I measured what the drag forces on the two anemones actually were in the field, it turns out that the drag forces the green animal encounters in surge channels are every bit as low as what the red animal encounters in very calm water. When I went beyond that to calculate what the stresses in the body walls of these animals would be, it turns out that the red animal, which appears to be in a very calm environment, is actually experiencing stresses 10 times greater than what the green animal experiences out in breaking waves.
The varying stresses within the anemones is not just to do with where they live. It also relates to the different ways in which they feed. A sea urchin is a typical meal for this anemone, whose mechanical design suits it perfectly for catching its prey.
The green anemone is sheared by a current. This leaves its oral disc pointing upwards, which is a great position to be in if you're trying to catch sea urchins and mussels that are dropping down on you. In contrast, the tall, slim anemone is a filter feeder. It feeds on small animals and plants suspended in the water. The current bends the oral disc of this animal over and exposes the maximum area of that filter to the current. So the mechanical designs of these two anemones are related very much to the ways in which these two animals make their living.
Most animals, of course, have more mobile ambitions than anemones. For them, a source of power has to be found. The engines which drive all animals are their muscles. Just how intimately muscles have to be integrated into the animal's overall design has been studied recently in sharks. Sharks are among the most ancient fish in the sea, but they are very efficient swimmers. To experiment with sharks, one first has to be caught, and that demands some care.
Come on, you missed. Oh, all right.
Well,
Get his nose in that net. Oh, here you go.
back this way once more.
Here he comes around. He's got it.
The investigations are led by Professor Steve Wainwright from Duke University.
Bring up this other net.
Head's in the net.
Oh, fish. And you pass on your side. Pressure transducer.
Okay, we're going right near the anal.
The purpose of this experiment is to find out how the pressure inside the shark changes when it swims.
This one's got a larger barrel. This will go on.
Right one's in. Rick, can you go around and start the recorder?
I think this one's working fine.
Pressure transducers are attached to each side of the shark's body and connected up to a recording device.
Right down left in on the one that just took a little jump. And then jump up 5 millimeters a second.
Animals with backbones are not supposed to be pressurized. Soft-bodied animals, like worms, generate internal pressure to keep themselves rigid. But vertebrates have skeletons which do this for them. However, from earlier work, Wainwright suspected that inside a shark, something rather odd was happening.
You ready to go up?
Ready.
Okay, going up.
We'll spin around in front of you, Rick.
All right, coming around in front of me.
Yeah, I've got to... Watch your feet. Watch your feet.
You guys are both in the line.
There. I got it.
That's great. Oh, superb.
Once the shark is swimming, the experiment can begin.
This is a chart recorder, and it's hooked up to the pressure transducers that are actually in the shark that's swimming around the tank at this time. And this instrument is able to measure the change in pressure as it occurs in the shark as he swims. And you can see that he's swimming slowly now, and any motion of this line to the right or to the left indicates a change of pressure. To the left is a higher pressure, to the right is a lower pressure. This is slow swimming.
Finding out that sharks are pressurized was remarkable enough. Still more surprising was the discovery that sometimes the pressure recorded increases enormously. It happens when a shark abruptly changes direction or gives a sudden burst of speed. Then the pressure can rise by 10 times, and that presents special design problems, as Steve Wainwright explains.
If this is to serve as a model of a shark, which we believe that perhaps it might, it must be able to accept additional pressure, which we have shown happens in the shark. But let's look what happens in this model when we put up the pressure. Oh, we get an aneurysm. Now this is really bad news. Sharks cannot afford to have aneurysms any more than you or I can. And this aneurysm arises from the simple geometry of this cylinder. Any cylinder, when it is pressurized, has twice the stress in the circumferential direction that it does in the longitudinal direction, and every time you increase the pressure, you will get an aneurysm.
To see how a shark avoids this, the mechanical properties of its skin were examined.
Coming in again there, the stretch meter is going very well. He's turning.
These studies involved filming a shark as it swims in the tank. Pinned to its side is a sliding marker, which shows how much the skin is stretching as its body bends from side to side. The movements are not easy to see, but when the film is slowed down, the sliding of the pin shows up well enough to be measured. When the shark swims slowly, it turned out, the skin is quite flexible. But during fast swimming, when the pressure increases, it suddenly becomes very stiff. This change in stiffness could be due to fibers in the skin. If so, the way the fibers were arranged would be very important.
The first way is in this model here, where we have the fibers running with the red lines up and down the cylinder and around the cylinder. And if we now try to make this model behave like a shark, first of all, we know the skin has to stretch. And if I try to stretch this balloon and pull it, I get nowhere. If we try to make it go bend backwards and forwards, as a shark must do, we see that as we bend it, we get into kinks. And kinks are as bad for the shark as aneurysms. So this is clearly an inappropriate model.
When shark skin was examined under a microscope, the fibers were visible. They run across each other, so polarized light shows them up as differently colored layers. The fibers spiral around the shark's entire body in a tightly knit series of helices. It's a much better arrangement, as the model demonstrates.
Now we see that this one stretches very nicely, and also when it comes to bending, it bends very nicely. If it does happen to bend so far that it kinks, a little increased pressure causes the kink to disappear. Bend till it kinks, increase the pressure. So an increased pressure inside makes it even better for resisting the kinks that come with bending. So we can see that this then is really the best and most appropriate method for fiber reinforcing a cylinder to get around the dangers of aneurysms and kinks.
The clever design of the skin means it helps the shark run smoothly in one further way. The shark's swimming muscles are attached to its skin, as well as to its backbone, so the skin functions as an additional element of the overall skeletal structure.
It's like a tendon, a whole body tendon, a sheath that fits over the entire body, whose job it is to pass on the contraction of muscle, both the shortening and the force of muscle contraction, to the tail of the shark to give it the powerful swimming motion that it has.
The final design problems faced by nature have to do with size. The scale on which an animal is built makes a big difference. From Harvard University, Professor Tom McMahon.
Animals of different size work differently. The small ones talk in squeaky voices, their hearts beat faster, they take a greater number of breaths per minute than large animals, even though they may look grossly the same. But on a closer examination, it's even apparent that, for example, looking at the skeletons of large and small animals, that the skeleton of the larger animal is relatively more robustly built. The ratio of the diameter to the length in the larger animal is greater than it is in the smaller one. So there are regular distortions in the proportions of animals as the size increases from the small to the large. And we're interested in knowing what are the design rules that must have dictated that regular change in proportions.
McMahon devised a theory which accounted for the way animals changed shape as they got larger. The theory applied to trees as well, so he used them for his experiments. The problem is this: big trees need to be stronger than little ones. They are all made from the same material, wood, so the only way of doing this is to grow into a stronger shape. To stand up to environmental forces and marauding scientists, trees get thicker as they grow taller. McMahon's theory set out to predict exactly how much thicker a taller tree needed to be. Other theories had considered the forces which would break trees. McMahon decided that what happens when a tree bends is more important. The theory is highly mathematical, but one way of looking at it is this. The plastic rod represents a hypothetical tree. As it grows, it has to withstand forces which try to knock it over. Up to a certain height, it's stable and springs back again. If it keeps on growing, it reaches a critical point where it's unstable and falls over. The useful length of a branch is limited in a similar way. As it grows out, it bends under its own weight. There is a point of maximum extension, about here. Beyond it, the branch sags back towards the tree. How far a branch can grow depends on two things: how thick it is and the elasticity of its material. A thinner branch can't reach out so far, but it bends in an identical way. It's this elastic similarity which is at the heart of McMahon's ideas. His theory made an important prediction. It predicted the frequency with which branches and trees of different lengths would vibrate. So a series of bizarre tree-shaking experiments had to be staged.
I'm pulling on the tree in such a way as to catch its natural rhythm, just the way you do when you were pushing a child on a swing. I've already done this same experiment on that smaller branch over there. And when I did it on the branch, I found that the natural rhythm was about 1 cycle per second. So in 15 seconds, there were 15 shakes of the branch. But now I'm doing the whole tree. I would calculate that in 15 seconds, we should go through about 9 shakes. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9.5. This is only one tree, but I've done the same experiment with hundreds of trees, and I find that as long as the experiments are confined to within a species, that the theory always predicts the right relation between the frequency and the length. The answer comes out right.
Not everyone accepts that McMahon's theory is right. But there is at least one good reason why nature should design living creatures in just this way.
Apparently, organisms are always sensing the forces of the environment and finding out how much they bend. And if they bend too much, they thicken themselves up. And that's different, you see, from working out whether or not they're going to break, because you can only break once, and that's it. You can't learn from breaking. You can learn from bending, though, and that seems to be an organizing principle in biology.
Scale also affects the way animals move. Swans are among the largest birds that fly, and they only just get into the air. As birds get smaller, flying becomes easier, and they are able to hover. But hovering is expensive, so even quite small birds can't do it for long. But smaller still, hovering becomes easy. The way animals can fly like this is being studied in insects, the smallest flyers of all. The studies are being carried out here at Cambridge University in England. The work is difficult to do. Insects have to be filmed at high speed, 5,000 frames a second. And the insects aren't always interested in helping. Finally, one flies into view, and the camera is triggered. Dozens of insects have been filmed. Slowed down 200 times, their grace and beauty are revealed. Understanding how insects hover is complicated because their wings beat very fast and they continually change shape. Each wing movement is measured so the researchers can analyze what's going on. The first results showed that most insects, this is a ladybug, hover in the same basic way. What's special about this kind of flight? Charlie Ellington.
Well, for an insect to hover, it has to blow air down to get enough force to support its body weight. Now, it does this by generating a series of vortex rings which travel down. And we know vortex rings generally as smoke rings, which you can see traveling along in a given direction, and you can see the smoke swirling inside it. And the smoke travels along so that it's the same mass of air involved that's moving.
The way some butterflies do this is easy to understand. They beat their wings vertically. Each sweep pushes them up and the air down. The principle can be seen using a mechanical butterfly. The flow is made visible with smoke. Air is sucked between the wings each time they open. It's pushed out again at the bottom as a vortex ring. But the butterfly's vertical wing beats are exceptional. Most insects, like this bee, beat their wings horizontally. The way they push air down is more subtle. Again, the model shows how. This time, vortices are shed at the beginning and end of each stroke. It's the sudden change in direction which sends the air swirling down. This kind of flight doesn't work for insects which are really small. Fruit flies are only 2 millimeters long, and to them, air is as viscous as molasses. But the studies here have discovered the secret of how such very small insects fly. What these insects do is to make sure their wings close at the end of each beat.
The wings come together and fling open. And then they beat as they were before, but they're just meeting dorsally or on the back of the insect. As they fling open about the trailing edge of the wing, the air gets sucked down into this gap. The wings then separate, and you've created this huge downrush of air, much greater than you do under normal hovering.
The clap and fling is a clever way to boost energy output, and it was completely unknown before these studies of natural engineering began. There is still one final surprise in store. It comes from the microscopic world of single-celled creatures. At this level, everything is very sticky indeed. The relative viscosity has increased 1 million times. The very first of nature's designs, bacteria, live here. So what sort of lives do they lead? Professor Howard Berg.
Well, the problem for a bacterium is that it's extraordinarily small. It's only a few wavelengths of light in linear dimensions, and it's continuously buffeted by molecules in its surrounding. It jiggles about, it does Brownian motion. And it's also locked into its environment by viscous forces. It knows nothing about inertia, so that if a bacterium is swimming along at top speed and suddenly turns off its engines, it can't coast. It will stop, in fact, in about 1/10 of the diameter of a hydrogen atom. So it's hard to imagine what that world is like. It's like, well, for you, be swimming in, say, asphalt on a spring afternoon.
A complex cell like a paramecium has solved the problem of swimming. They push themselves along by beating thousands of tiny hairs which line the sides of their bodies. Bacteria too have tiny hairs, called flagella, and it's the way they move which has proved to be such a surprise.
It had been thought for a long time that these were a primitive sort of muscle and that they bend, that they wave. But what appears to be true now is that they're in fact rigid filaments and they rotate. That is to say, there's a rotary engine at the base of this filament that makes it go around, and it can go both clockwise or counterclockwise. So what is startling about this is that it's the only known example of an organism, a kind of organism that has a rotary joint or a wheel. In a sense, nature invented the wheel.
It's an extraordinary and unlikely idea, yet the rotation can be seen in a clever experiment.
Well, one of the most dramatic ways of demonstrating flagellar rotation is to do what we call a tethered cell experiment, which I can model with this mechanical mouse. If the mouse has a rotary tail, but if you hold on to the tail, then the body will spin. And with a bacterium, you can coat the flagellum with an antibody and stick it down to a microscope slide. And I have a film here which shows this experiment.
With their tails tied down, the bacteria's bodies revolve instead. The rotation looks so clear, why hasn't it been recognized before? One reason is that the beating movements of the tail could be produced in two confusingly different ways.
There have been two basic models that one wants to distinguish. One in which the motion of the flagellum occurs by a wave propagation, which this model will illustrate, and another in which it, in fact, the tail or flagellum, in fact, rotates rigidly. Now, in this model, a rubber tube is being pushed now forward, now downward, now back, now upward, in a synchronous manner, in a helical fashion. Now, that looks as if it's rotating, but I assert that it is not. And one can show that by putting a marker on the filament. As the wave propagates, the ball wobbles, but it does not go around, it does not rotate. Now, one can do another experiment and rotate the body, and now it looks as if the tail is stationary, but in fact it's not. It's rotating. It has to be rotating because it's attached to the head, and one can demonstrate that. The marker now rotates with the head and with the tail. What a bacterium appears to do is quite different. It doesn't have a tube. In fact, it has just a rigid wire, and it literally rotates. And this is what a flagellar motion in a bacterium is, that this is literally going around relative to the body. And you see the marker is rotating with the tail. If I do the other experiment, the tail stands stationary and the body goes around. So there's a rotary joint in biology, and that's really what is new.
How the joint works is now being investigated. The tails were pulled away from bacteria's bodies. On the end of each one, a curious hook was seen. These pictures are the clearest that have been taken, and the details of the structures can just be made out. The hook consists of a rod and a series of plates. The current idea is that the plates fit into the bacterial cell wall and are driven around like a tiny electric motor. It's an elegant design, so why don't other animals have wheels?
It may be when we understand how this engine works, we'll realize it doesn't scale, that you can't make a big one. It may be that since to have a rotary drive, you have to have a rigid framework on which to bolt it, that nature abandoned this idea when it invented higher cells that are in fact fluid and not rigid. I think the answer to that question will have to wait until we really understand more about how the machine works.
Natural engineering is still in its infancy. No doubt there will be many more surprises to come. It isn't helping us to build better bridges or automobiles, but perhaps that doesn't matter. The English philosopher Herbert Spencer put it well when he wrote, "Those who have never entered upon scientific pursuits know not a tithe of the poetry by which they are surrounded." Increasing our sense of wonder in living things is justification enough.
For a transcript, send $2 to this address. Nova is made possible by grants from this station and other public television stations. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies.